What a really exciting speaker coming up for you next. Now, have any of you been wondering why there's a whopping great shipping container at the bottom of the stairs in the exhibition hall? If you have, our next speaker is going to explain all to you. We're talking about standards in a global world. Now, our next speaker is a professor. She's the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. In fact, she developed their managerial communication curriculum. She's been examining communication and information as shaped by technology and policy and is going to talk us through all of that. And as I said, standards in a global world. We're really grateful to Sibos University, who've brought the professor here. Sibos University, of course, funded and brought here by SWIFT, the SWIFT Institute. So please give a warm Sibos welcome to Professor Joanne Yates. Professor.
Good afternoon. I'm really very pleased to be here at Sibos. I was especially pleased when I came in to the floor by those containers. They made me feel very much at home. For the last several years, I've been studying the history of industrial standards and how they emerged and over time what the philosophy behind standardization is, and then how specific examples of that, like containers, have affected the world economy. So today I'm going to try to share a little of that with you with the hopes that it has some relevance and resonance with some of the standardization in the financial world that SWIFT manages. So let me start with a question that everyone asked me several years ago when we first started studying standards. The first question was, why would you want to study standards? People often assume that that's going to be really boring, but the more you look at it, the more interesting it is. Standards are around us everywhere. Our whole world functions on standards. If we don't have screws that are standard screw threads, we can't replace a screw once you've lost it from a piece of mechanical work. If you don't have standard kinds of steel structures, steel stretchers, you can't create a telephone wire holder. If you don't have standard links between various electronic devices, you can't function at all. I don't know what I did before we had USB drives, for example. All these things are what make our world work, and the presence or absence of standards is a major source of both our ability to get things done or our inability to get things done. When standards aren't there is when we run into trouble. So the whole standards world is definitely around us. But in some ways, I'm less interested in the specific standard itself than in the process that gets us there. Standardizing, we can think of it as happening along a continuum. On the one hand, there's the market side, where things get standardized because they win out in the market. So Microsoft Windows or VHS videotape back in the old days when it went out over beta. On the other end of that continuum is regulation, where a government body tells you, you must do it this way, this will be the standard. You know, the FDA in the US or some other regulatory agency tells you that that's what you must do. But in between that, there is a whole world of what's called voluntary consensus standard setting organizations, and that's what I'm interested in. So voluntary consensus standard setting organizations include at least 3 levels of types of organizations. They can be engineering societies, for example. The IEEE is the electrical engineering body, and that's where a lot of industry and engineers get together and try to figure out what good standards are technically. On the national level, you have ANSI in the US or BSI in Britain. Those are the national standardization bodies. And then finally, ISO at the peak of the pyramid, in a sense, of the international system. So ISO and IEC, which I will talk about in a moment, are both international bodies that include a lot of representatives from lots of different countries, and they arrive at these standards as well. So this whole mechanism, this voluntary consensus standard setting mechanism, the vast majority of standards that we deal with all the time are arrived at through this institutional mechanism. It's a really interesting and unusual institutional mechanism. Let's look at how it actually works. As one might guess from the name, voluntary consensus standard setting, which is the standard way we talk about these, there are two key characteristics, voluntary and consensus. So voluntary first. That means two kinds of voluntary. First, it's up to companies to decide whether to adopt the standards or not. There's no one saying you are mandated to do this standard. It's a voluntary opt-in system, essentially. But there's another component of voluntary, and that is that the stakeholders that get involved in setting the standards are, in some sense, volunteering their time, or their companies are volunteering their time to be part of this. So this is not something that it's not the government paying people to set standards. It is a system where all the different stakeholders are volunteering people and time to do it. It's also based on consensus and a sense of balanced consensus. From the very beginning, around 1900, there was a sense that you always had to have both the manufacturers and the users of a given technology, and they had to be balanced on the committee that would arrive at a standard. And actually, in many cases, they said, and there had to be a third party, so that's the three-legged stool. The third party were unaffiliated engineers. They were either consultants or academics who served on these committees. So this notion of balance was really central to the philosophy of standardization when it emerged during this period. The idea was that ultimately you had to get to a solution that everyone could live with. And to do that, you had to have all the players at the table. No one was going to win the whole thing, get exactly what they wanted, but somehow you could arrive at, you could talk until you came to a point that everyone could live with. So even in the handling of objections, although consensus in this sense doesn't mean 100% everyone says yes and loves it, it means that there can't be substantial disagreement. And there's a long process by which these organizations, whenever an objection is raised, they have to respond to it. It's not that they can't ultimately overrule someone eventually, but not easily. You have to go through a long process of showing that you understand what the objection is, responding to it in writing, and making it very clear that you've considered it very carefully. You can't just say, we're going to ignore that. You have to deal with it. So this process is a process that's designed to help reach the best possible answer or outcome for the whole group of participants in it. Not necessarily for any one participant, but for the whole set of participants. So in the industrial world, voluntary consensus standard setting arose right around the turn of the 20th century. It came out of the 19th century creation of engineering societies, starting with civil engineering and going on to mechanical and railroad and mining engineering. A whole set of engineering societies emerged in the industrialized countries in the 19th century. And the initial steps towards standardization took place in these societies. So, for example, some of the earliest were around safety. Steam boilers in steamships that went up and down rivers would all too often during this era explode with just horrific consequences. So everyone felt that this was a major safety concern. So both in the US and in Germany, in fact, engineering societies sort of took on this, let's figure out how thick the steel has to be, what the safety valves need to be, and so on, to make sure that those don't blow up. And they came up with those. In some cases, those were actually ultimately made mandatory, but they weren't originally. Screw threads, that's a different kind of standard. That one's not around safety, but about compatibility, interchangeability of parts. Without that, you buy a machine from one machinist, and then if you need a new screw for it, you had to go back to that same machinist. You couldn't go to anyone else. There was no interchangeability across them. So both in the US and in Britain, someone in each of those countries took on this, let's try to standardize screw threads. And that meant sort of the angle of them, whether the bottom was curved or very spiky, and exactly how the distance was between the screw threads. There's a whole set of metrics that they used in doing that. So that was a compatibility issue. Finally, steel rails, which was around a performance issue. As railroads became a bigger and bigger deal, they needed rails that they could count on. And the steel rails, sort of the standardization of steel rails really came at the end of the 19th century, and they kind of led into the next phase of standardization. Because when you were trying to standardize steel rails, it wasn't enough just to go to, for example, the Railroad Association or the railroad engineers. You also had to include the steel manufacturers and the organizations that they were in. So it started crossing different lines of organizations. That took us to the first actual national standards body, and that emerged in the UK. Why in the UK first? The reason for that according to the historian of this, is that they were trying to come up with standards for empire. They wanted steel rails that would be standard both in England, but also in India. And they wanted that to be a workable system. So what they ended up doing, and it was steel rails that were the impetus on this, 5 engineering societies came together and formed a committee. That committee sat within the Civil Engineering Association, but it was sort of an independent committee within that. So it was 5 of these different engineering societies. The funding came from their biggest customers, and in Britain at that time, the biggest customers for these kinds of industrial products were the government. So it was, the Admiralty and the India Office and the War Office. That's where the need was for these standards, and so that's where the money came from as well. They set up a certain amount of infrastructure around this. They set up sectional committees so for each type of problem, they had a sectional committee. They brought in additional people from elsewhere to serve on various committees as needed. And they created a secretary, Charles Lemaistre. This is Charles Lemaistre. He is a figure who appears again and again and again through the first half of the 20th century. He was a major force in spreading the whole philosophy of standardizing around the world. He believed that it was a truly wonderful thing that was good for the world and that everyone should be supporting this. So after this 1901 founding of the UK organization, there was sort of a gap of over a decade, and then World War I began. And World War I triggered the next round of countries to create their own standardizing bodies. So the US, the Dutch, and the German all did that. Interestingly enough, they all followed the same model, which was the model that was set up in the UK in the first place. And there's evidence that the leaders of all the organizations for all 3 of those countries had contact with Lemaistre in an earlier period, although, of course, during the war, they probably weren't talking a whole lot back and forth between Germany and the UK. So the next stage is to go from the national organization to an international organization. And this happened almost immediately, right on top of it practically. And the first place that appeared was in electrical engineering. It was spurred by the emergence of electrical science and technology. For a while, there had been every, 4 or 5 years, there would be a big periodic electrical congress. Whenever there was a worldwide exhibition, there would be an electrical congress. And at the same time, and mostly what happened at those electrical congresses is the scientists argued over the terminology. What are we going to call an ohm, what we ended up calling an ohm, and a watt, and so on. They argued about what the units were going to be. But they also saw the need for people who knew more about, the machinery, generators, and the power they were creating. Meanwhile, electrical engineering societies were popping up everywhere in the late 19th century. So the creation of the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission, happened out of a series of events. It started with the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, and in conjunction with that, there was an international congress, another international electrical congress. Those people at that committee, for the first time, called for an ongoing organization. Instead of just an organization that came together and then fell apart again and then 4 years later tried again, they wanted something that actually had some continuity. So they called for the creation of an ongoing one. So 2 years later, a group of standardizers and electrical engineers came together and hammered out a constitution. That constitution was actually, it set the pattern for all the other international standardization organizations, so it's rather important. First thing they decided is one nation, one vote. It seems obvious to us now, but wasn't necessarily obvious, so it could easily have been done on the basis of the level of industry in your country or something like that. It was decided it would be one nation, one vote. It was also decided that the delegation shouldn't be chosen by the government. The government shouldn't have anything to do with this. It should be the electrical engineering societies or the national standards organizations that pick the people. It should be technical people. So they set up this system, and then in 1908, so they agreed on a constitution in 1906. In 1908, they had gotten all the countries to ratify it, and they came together again. And at this point, they decided they needed a secretary to support the operations. And our friend Charles Lemaistre, again, was chosen to be secretary. And the headquarters for IEC were actually set up in the same building as the headquarters for ESC, the British Association. They were all in the same building. But Charles Lemaistre would remain the secretary of the IEC, became Secretary General, I think they called him later, of the IEC, but he remained that for 50 years. So the IEC was an international standards organization, but it only worked in one realm of, one technical realm, electricity. The first attempt to set a general one was an interwar attempt. Between World War I and World War II, there was an attempt to establish one. It was called ISA, the International Standards Association. Of course, our friend Lemaistre was involved, but quickly it kind of became too contentious and not very productive. Part of the problem was the contrast between metric and imperial units. There was lots of fighting back and forth on that. And soon the British just dropped out of it. And the Americans joined late and then sort of stood on the sidelines. So really, they didn't get a whole lot done. But after World War II, the next phase was much more successful. ISO, the International Organization for Standards, was actually created right in the wake of World War II. So in 1946 in London, the picture shows you the men who gathered, men, unfortunately all men, yes, who gathered together in 1946 in London to agree on a new organization, to set up a new organization. They followed the IEC in allotting one nation, one vote, in saying that national standards bodies, not governments, should determine the delegation, although they also said if a country did not have a national standards organization, then the government should do it. That became a bigger deal later because as more and more, so the industrialized countries all had standards organizations, but as more and more less industrialized nations joined later, more often it was government who determined it. So one of the things that these engineers all believed in very strongly was that the technical should outweigh the political. They did not believe that the political should be driving things. And they worked very hard to get past that. For example, even though the Cold War was just getting ready to hype up here, they insisted on, they managed with a lot of backroom diplomacy to keep the USSR in this during this time. They got the defeated powers all in it by 1952. This was non-trivial. And actually, during the Cold War, they had many meetings. ISO would have meetings behind the Iron Curtain. So they would go and meet in Czechoslovakia. And I've read correspondence by at least one of these engineers who came back from a trip and saying, wow, those Czechoslovakian engineers really know what they're doing. So it gave, at least on the technical level, there was really good communication there. So now, I've told you how we got to the ISO. Now I wanted to show you what the ISO has done, and in particular to focus on that wonderful container up front there. Because containers, ISO standard containers, helped create a global transportation infrastructure that revolutionized the markets, the global markets. I mean, this is considered by many the biggest thing that standards did in the second half of the 20th century, but it's also just had a huge impact on trade, as you will see in a moment. So why standard containers? Why did they need them in the first place? Well, containers themselves could reduce costs in ports, because ports, the traditional ship, what would happen is they would be, in the olden days, stuffed with up to 200,000 bundles of different sizes and shapes. So longshoremen at the ports would put all of them in and then take all of them out when they got to the other end. This took an incredible amount of time. It was incredibly inefficient, and there was lots of pilferage in the process. So containers were an idea that both the government, the military in the US, and some other private companies saw were not, containers would be a possible solution to those problems. But to really get the maximum benefit, you needed them to be intermodal. You wanted them to cross both companies. You wanted the same size to fit different companies' equipment, but you also wanted it to work for trucks, for trains, and for ships, and cut across all of these, because it's the intermodal part of it that was really going to make the biggest difference. But to get to that point, you had to have a standard container. At the point when this all started, there were two American companies that each had proprietary container systems, and the US government had their ConX containers that they used, all three different. And for totally idiosyncratic reasons that had to do with the particular ships they were using, they determined the size and the length and so on. But to have a worldwide center, you needed standardization, a worldwide system from manufacturing to the ultimate place where it was going to get used to take something. So standardizing efforts in this picked up steam in the late 50s. In 1957, the ASA, the American Standards Association, which is the forerunner of ANSI, created a committee and started working on this standardizing. And they moved towards, they spent a lot of time arguing, but they moved towards a system of having 10, 20, 30, and 40-foot containers, which none of those already existed. The two proprietary systems and the government systems, all those things that were out there already, didn't use that set of lengths. But 40 feet was the maximum length you could have for a train car by regulation. So they said, okay, let's have the maximum length we can have, and then an 8x8 cross-section, and then cut them up so you could make combinations of them. So they had gotten, by 1961, they had approved the 10, 20, 30, 40 lengths. The final standard, the American standard, didn't get issued till 65, but by 61 they had agreed on that, and everyone had pretty much bought in. In 1961, at that very same time, ISO got into it. They created Technical Committee 104. Technical Committee 104 was trying to come up with an international standard. They adopted the same lengths. At a certain point, they tried to add some additional ones in, but they were never really adopted, so they got rid of them ultimately. So this was a successful effort ultimately. By 67, they had arrived at a standard, but it was a very lengthy effort. Actually, the standard wasn't published till 1970, but everyone had agreed by 67. So it took a long time, 61 to 67, to get to that standard. And the process also required that one of the stakeholders actually release its intellectual property, its patents. The particular company who had a proprietary system. A shipping company had its own proprietary ones, whose length got rejected. All of their equipment was made obsolete, essentially, by the decisions these committees made. But at a later stage in the process, they needed the remaining piece, was the corners that hold together. You know, on each of the corners of those containers, you have to have a fastener that is how you link them together on ships and how you lift them and move them as well. And the best solution was the corner fasteners, a variation on the corner fasteners that one company had. But the committees were not willing to take anything that had a patent on it that was going to be charged for. So it wasn't going to be part of the standard if it had intellectual property rights attached to it. So they convinced this guy who had lost out on the length already, they convinced him to give up his IP. So this is an example of this system at its best, what it can actually do. The notion was that you wanted the standards to work for everyone. And yes, you fought for what you individually wanted on the way, but ultimately you hoped that once you lost, as in this case, everyone could agree at the best technical solution that would work for everyone. And they got there ultimately. So the immediate effects of this were mostly in the shipping piece of it. The port costs were reduced by 93%, which is a huge amount. And ship time in port might have been even more important. Instead of having the ship sit there for 3 weeks in the port getting loaded and unloaded, now 3 days would turn a ship around. So the use of that capital was much more efficient with that. The really interesting issue, though, is the long-term effect of this. And for a long time, people have argued that it built global trade, that containers built global trade. But there have always been a set of people who have said, no, 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 it's really the GATT or free trade or one of the other things. It's clear from the graph that the period of container adoption is the same as the period of this huge growth in global trade. But that doesn't necessarily say causality. It just says that they're in the same time period. So it isn't until just these last 2 years that a set of economists, Bernhofen, El-Sali, and Neller, have finally written this paper, which actually isn't even out yet, where they've used a set of panel data of pairs of countries, 157 countries, and done each of them pairwise to look at all of this. And this analytical strategy allows them to actually separate the effects of various things. What they found is a 500% increase in North-North trade. That's a cumulative increase over 15 years, the 15 years we're talking about, but a huge increase in trade that can be tracked directly to the containers. At the same time, the comparable figure for the GATT, for example, was 101%. So it's a big difference. It turns out that the argument that it was these policy variables is not right, according to this set of economists. It really is the container that had the bigger effect. And even though, obviously, North-North did the best, North-South and South-South were positive, had a positive effect, but nowhere near as big. So if you look over the whole world, you get a 370% increase overall. And the greatest effect was definitely tied to being used intermodally. Just having a port that took container ships wasn't enough. Having a port and a railroad system that took the containers on the rail cars, that's where the real gains were. They couldn't measure trucks because that's too decentralized, but they measured trains and ships. So that's where the big effect was. So I think the bottom line of this story is that by creating this end-to-end system where you could I mean, this is where supply chains come from, and all the things that we hear about all the time now, they are enabled by this kind of technology. And without this, we wouldn't be there yet. It had a huge impact on our world. During that period, we went from being primarily regional economies with some global to being primarily global with some regional. I mean, it really shifted the balance during there. So I think this shows what standards can actually do. ISO 20022, the financial standards, in a sense, is, I think, trying to do the same thing for the monetary part. And part of the reason you need that is because we now have these global trade flows. You now need the global money flows to go with that. So let me just end by saying I think that this whole world of voluntary consensus standard setting is a fascinating world that has had a huge impact on the economy. And I think SWIFT is actually playing a role in that now with ISO on the financial side. I haven't studied the financial side, but it's very clear that the industrial side has had a huge impact. And my sense from wandering around here is that the financial side is having a similar impact as well. Thank you.